If you're enjoying these stories, you can support us on Patreon. There are several unique stories over there that I haven't uploaded to YouTube. Please consider supporting me on Patreon if you can. Now, let's get into the story. The Adventure of the Woman at Margate. In the autumn of my long and intimate association with Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I had the privilege of chronicling a great many of his most singular deductions. Upon glancing over my notes for the year immediately preceding his temporary retirement, I find the records of several cases which, for various reasons of state or public discretion, have thus far been withheld from the world. Among these hidden manuscripts in my tin dispatch box at Cox & Co., there lies the full account of the affair of the second stain, a matter of such supreme political importance that even now I must tread lightly upon its details. Yet it was during the peripheral investigations of that very period, amidst the murky fogs of a London spring, that another entirely separate puzzle presented itself. It was a case which, though lacking the international gravity of a purloined diplomatic dispatch, possessed a psychological and scientific grotesquerie that marked it as uniquely suited to the peculiar genius of my friend. It was late in the month of May. The weather had taken a sudden and unseasonable turn, casting aside the usual grey weeping clouds of the London spring in favour of a brilliant, piercing sunshine that seemed to mock the soot-stained bricks of our Baker Street lodgings. I was seated in my usual armchair by the window, idly attempting to read a medical journal, while the glare of the morning sun illuminated the dancing motes of dust in the air. Holmes, however, was not disposed to idle relaxation. He was standing by the mantelpiece, his tall ascetic figure clad in his mouse-coloured dressing-gown, his sharp aquiline features concentrated upon a small glass vial containing a vile-smelling purple liquid. For 3 days he had been engaged in a chemical analysis of so malodorous a nature that Mrs. Hudson had threatened, not for the first time, to give us our notice. "You will find, Watson," Holmes remarked suddenly, without turning his head, "that the variations in the epidermal application of cosmetics among the female populace can provide as complete a geographical and chronological record as the mud upon a man's boots." I lowered my journal, accustomed to his sudden leaps of thought. "You are compiling another monograph, I suppose?" "I am merely observing the inevitable consequences of human vanity colliding with natural phenomena," he replied, holding the vial up to the sunlight. "Take, for example, the simple matter of facial powder. A delicate dusting of crushed talc or bismuth is the standard armament of the English lady of breeding. Yet when such powder is suddenly absent, when the canvas is left bare, it speaks to a disruption in habit. And habit, my dear Watson, is the very foundation of criminal investigation." Before I could inquire as to what had prompted this specific train of thought, the heavy tread of boots upon the stairs announced an arrival. The door to our sitting-room was flung open, and Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard stood upon the threshold. His ferret-like features were drawn tight with a mixture of professional frustration and urgent appeal. "Good morning, Lestrade," said Holmes, carefully stoppering his vial. "You look as though the entirety of the Metropolitan Police Force has been bested by a singular conundrum. I perceive you have caught an early train from the countryside. Kent, if I am not mistaken, judging by the specific chalky residue upon the hem of your trousers." Lestrade brushed hastily at his trousers. You are as sharp as ever, Mr. Holmes. Kent it is, specifically the town of Ashford. And it is not merely a conundrum, it is a brazen outrage. A provincial bank robbery coupled with a violent abduction. I have come straight from the victim's residence to seek your counsel. Holmes's eyes gleamed with the familiar spark of the chase. He gestured toward the basket chair. Pray, take a seat, Inspector. Watson, the cigars are on the sideboard. Now, Lestrade, lay the facts before us in their exact chronological order. Lestrade seated himself heavily, declining the cigar with a wave of his hand. The facts are these, Mr. Holmes. 3 days ago, on the Tuesday evening, the Ashford branch of the Provincial Counties Bank was robbed. The vault was accessed, and £50,000 in bearer bonds were removed. The vault was blown? I asked. No, Doctor, that is the rub. It was opened with the combination. The lock was entirely unblemished. Now, there are only 2 people in the world who possess the combination to that particular vault. One is the bank manager, Mr. Josiah Pendleton. The other is his wife, Mrs. Beatrice Pendleton, who acts as the primary key holder and associate manager in her husband's absence. A progressive arrangement, Holmes murmured, lighting his cherry-wood pipe. Indeed. Now, Mr. Pendleton was attending a bankers' convention in Edinburgh all of last week. We have verified his presence there. His alibi is utterly ironclad. That leaves Mrs. Pendleton. But before you leap to the conclusion that she simply opened the door and took the money, you must hear the rest of the tale. Lestrade leaned forward, his hands resting upon his knees. On Monday afternoon, the day before the robbery, Mrs. Pendleton travelled up to London to do some shopping in Oxford Street. She never returned to her hotel. She vanished without a trace. Ah, said Holmes, a cloud of thick blue smoke rising about his head. And she has since reappeared? She was found early this morning, Mr. Holmes, stumbling along a country lane near Dorking, dishevelled, terrified, and nearly delirious. She claims she was abducted in broad daylight. She says she was bundled into a closed carriage on a quiet London side street by 2 masked men, chloroformed and taken to a subterranean location. A dark, damp cellar, to be precise. She states she was held there in absolute pitch-black darkness for 3 entire days. 3 days in darkness, Holmes repeated softly. And the combination to the vault? Extracted from her under the threat of severe physical torture, Lestrade explained grimly. She says they deprived her of food, water and light, threatening to leave her to rot in the blackness if she did not surrender the sequence of numbers. Finally, broken by the cold and the dark, she gave it to them. They left her there for another day while they presumably executed the robbery in Ashford, and then returned to drug her once more, dumping her on the roadside where she was found. It is a harrowing tale, I observed, feeling a surge of sympathy for the poor woman. To be entombed alive in the dark for such a period is enough to shatter the strongest of nerves. Quite, Lestrade agreed. She is understandably distraught. I have had her brought to London as her husband is rushing down from Edinburgh to meet her. She is currently resting in a private parlour at Scotland Yard, but she insists upon speaking with you, Mr. Holmes. She believes the Yard is unequipped to catch her tormentors. She flatters me, Holmes said dryly, but her narrative presents certain theatrical elements. A dark, damp cellar, chloroform, masked men. It is the very staple of the penny dreadful. Are you suggesting she is lying? I asked, taken aback. I am suggesting nothing, Watson. I am merely observing the architecture of the narrative. Lestrade, bring the lady to Baker Street. I must hear this tale from her own lips, and more importantly, I must observe the narrator." Lestrade nodded briskly and departed. Within the hour, the clatter of wheels upon the cobblestones below signalled his return. Mrs. Hudson showed our visitors up, and into our sitting-room stepped Mrs. Beatrice Pendleton. She was a woman in her early 30s, dressed in an elegant but terribly rumpled travelling gown of dark navy silk. Her posture bespoke extreme fatigue, and she leaned heavily upon Lestrade's arm as she entered. Yet what struck me most was her face. She possessed fine aristocratic features, but her complexion was strangely florid. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and she trembled with a nervous exhaustion that seemed entirely consistent with her harrowing ordeal. "Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice a reedy whisper, "I thank you for seeing me. I am entirely broken. The horrors of that lightless tomb." She shuddered violently and sank into the chair I hurriedly brought forward for her. "Compose yourself, madam," Holmes said soothingly, though his keen grey eyes were darting over her person with the intensity of a hawk observing a field mouse. He took in her ruined dress, the scuffs upon her sensible leather boots, the slight trembling of her gloved hands, and finally his gaze settled upon her face, resting there for a remarkably long moment. "You have suffered a severe shock. Would you care for a glass of water, or perhaps a drop of brandy?" "Water, please," she murmured. I poured her a glass from the carafe. As she reached to take it, her high collar parted slightly, revealing a silver chain around her neck. Suspended from it was a rather curious piece of jewellery, a flat, circular locket faced with a pane of clear glass rather than the usual solid metal cover. Holmes's eyes flashed toward the object, but his tone remained entirely conversational. "You have recounted your ordeal to the inspector, Mrs. Pendleton, but I find that the smallest details often hold the key to the greatest mysteries. Pray, describe to me this cellar in which you were confined." Mrs. Pendleton took a trembling sip of water. "It was the very mouth of hell, Mr. Holmes. They dragged me down a flight of stone steps. I could smell the damp earth and the rot. When they slammed the heavy wooden door shut, the darkness was absolute. It was a suffocating, physical blackness. I could not see my own hand when I held it an inch from my face. And there was no source of illumination whatsoever?" Holmes pressed softly. "No crack beneath the door? No grating to the street above?" "None," she insisted, her voice breaking. "It was entirely sealed. For 3 days I sat huddled on the freezing dirt floor, surrounded by nothing but the dripping of condensation and the utter void of night. I lost all sense of time. When they finally came to demand the combination to the bank vault, the light of their dark lantern nearly blinded me. I held out as long as I could, Mr. Holmes, but the threat of being left in that black pit forever. I confess my weakness. I gave them the numbers." "No one could blame you, madam," I said reassuringly. Holmes steepled his fingers, leaning back in his chair. "A pitch-black cellar, freezing damp, for 3 days. It is a vivid picture. Tell me, Mrs. Pendleton, did you struggle with your captors?" "I fought with all my might when they dragged me into the carriage, but the ether-soaked rag overcame me swiftly." "I see." Holmes leaned forward suddenly, his gaze fixed upon her face. "You must forgive a personal observation, madam, but I note a curious omission in your toilette." A lady of your obvious refinement would rarely travel to London for shopping without applying powder to her nose and cheeks. Yet your face is entirely unpowdered, and if I am not mistaken, the skin across the bridge of your nose and the tops of your cheeks is notably red and slightly peeling." Mrs. Pendleton stiffened, her hand flying instinctively to her face. A flash of something, was it panic, crossed her features before she smoothed it into a mask of weary indignation. "Really, Mr. Holmes, I have just been rescued from a terrifying abduction. I have been kept in a freezing damp cellar for 3 days. The dampness and the rough conditions caused my skin to chafe terribly. I have hardly had the means or the inclination to apply cosmetic powders." Of course," Holmes murmured, a strange, placid smile touching his lips. "It was an impertinent observation. I apologize. The dampness of a cellar can indeed play havoc with the skin." His eyes drifted down to her neck once more. "That is a fascinating trinket you wear. A photographic locket, is it not? Of the novelty variety that has recently become fashionable?" Mrs. Pendleton looked down at her chest, her hand covering the glass-faced locket. "Yes, it was a gift from my husband. It contains a miniature of him. May I examine it? I have a keen amateur interest in photography." She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the silver rim. "It is deeply personal to me, Mr. Holmes. I assure you I shall not open the clasp. I merely wish to admire the craftsmanship of the glass setting." Reluctantly, she leaned forward, allowing Holmes to take the heavy pendant in his long, sensitive fingers. He did not attempt to open it. He simply tilted it so that the light from the window fell directly upon the glass face. I peered over his shoulder, expecting to see a miniature portrait of a respectable bank manager. Instead, beneath the glass, there was nothing but a square of paper that was entirely, uniformly and solidly pitch black. "Ah," said Holmes, releasing the locket, "a very handsome piece, truly unique." "The picture has faded," she said hastily, sitting back. "The dampness of the cellar must have ruined the delicate paper." "Doubtless," Holmes replied, his tone impenetrable. "Well, Mrs. Pendleton, you have provided me with a most compelling narrative. I believe I have all the facts I require. Lestrade, I suggest you take the lady back to Scotland Yard to await her husband. Watson and I have some inquiries to make." Lestrade looked bewildered. "Inquiries? Where, Mr. Holmes? In London? Or shall we go to Ashford to examine the bank?" "Neither, for the moment," Holmes said cheerfully, bounding up from his chair. "I must visit the post office. There is a great deal of correspondence to be managed. Good day to you, Mrs. Pendleton. I trust your ordeal is very nearly at an end." When the door had closed behind them, I turned to Holmes, who was already shrugging off his dressing-gown and reaching for his frock coat. "Holmes," I said, "what on earth was the meaning of that interrogation? You questioned her about her face powder, and you stared at a ruined photograph. How does this help us find the men who locked her in a cellar and robbed the Ashford Bank?" Holmes turned to me, his eyes blazing with that cold, triumphant light I knew so well. "My dear Watson, we are not looking for the men who locked her in a cellar." "We are not?" "No, because the men who locked her in a cellar do not exist. The cellar itself does not exist. The entire story is a fabrication, a tissue of lies so poorly constructed that it unravels at the slightest tug of scientific logic." I stared at him in utter astonishment. But her distress, her dishevelled appearance, the stolen bonds— "The bonds are certainly stolen," and she is certainly distressed, though her distress stems from the fear of being caught rather than the memory of a dark room. Grab your hat, Watson. We have a train to catch, but not to Ashford. Where are we going? First to the telegraph office, and then, if my deductions hold true, we shall take a trip to the seaside. Have you ever visited Margate in the late spring, Watson? I hear the weather has been exceptionally glorious. The journey to the Central Telegraph Office was accomplished in a brisk, silent walk. Holmes dispatched no fewer than 4 lengthy telegrams, the contents of which he shielded from my view with a playful smirk. Following this, we returned to Baker Street, where Holmes spent the next 3 hours entirely consumed by a massive leather-bound volume of the cross-referencing dates with a fervour that bordered on the manic. It was mid-afternoon when the replies to his telegrams began to arrive. With each yellow slip handed to him by the commissionaire, his smile grew wider. Finally, he clapped the book shut with a resounding thud. "The case is complete, Watson," he announced. The final piece of the puzzle has fallen into place with the precision of a Swiss timepiece. I have sent a message to Lestrade. He is bringing Mrs. Pendleton and her newly arrived husband here at 5 o'clock. We shall have a cosy little gathering, and I shall unveil the truth behind the phantom cellar. "Holmes," I pleaded, thoroughly exasperated by his theatricality, "will you not give me a hint? What of the locket? What of her face?" "Patience, my dear doctor. The explanation requires an audience to truly appreciate its simplicity. Until then, I suggest we partake of some cold beef and a glass of claret." Promptly at 5 o'clock, our sitting-room was crowded once more. Inspector Lestrade arrived, looking entirely baffled, accompanied by Mrs. Pendleton, who looked significantly more composed, and a stout, red-faced man with mutton-chop whiskers, whom I deduced to be Mr. Josiah Pendleton, the bank manager. Mr. Pendleton was in a state of high agitation. "Mr. Holmes," he blustered, hardly waiting for introductions, "I do not understand why we have been summoned back to your lodgings. My poor wife has suffered unspeakable tortures. The bank is ruined. We should be hunting these brutes, not sitting about in Baker Street." "Pray, sit down, Mr. Pendleton," Holmes said, his voice carrying an icy authority that instantly quelled the banker's bluster. "I have summoned you here because I have solved the mystery of the Ashford bank robbery, and I know exactly where your wife was during those missing 3 days." "You know where the cellar is?" Lestrade cried eagerly, whipping out his notebook. "There is no cellar, Lestrade," Holmes said softly. He stepped to the centre of the room, fixing his penetrating gaze upon Mrs. Pendleton. The woman visibly shrank beneath his stare. "The cellar is a phantom, a dramatic fiction invented to explain an absence and to provide a coerced alibi for a willing accomplice." "How dare you!" Mr. Pendleton roared, half rising from his chair. "My wife was abducted." "Sit down, sir," Holmes barked, "and listen. Your wife was not abducted. She willingly surrendered the combination of your vault to her accomplices, most likely a lover and his confederate, and then absented herself to establish a false alibi while they cleared the safe of its £50,000 in bearer bonds." "This is an outrage," Mrs. Pendleton gasped, pressing a handkerchief to her lips. "I was in the dark. I was freezing. My skin chafed from the dampness of that horrid pit." "Ah, yes, the skin," Holmes said, a predatory smile touching his lips. "Let us discuss your skin, madam. You claimed the redness and peeling upon your nose and cheeks were the result of the damp cellar. But earlier today I noted the distinct lack of face powder on your visage. A lady in an agitated state might forget her powder, yes. But a lady with a severe peeling sunburn apply powder, for it would cake disastrously upon the flaking skin, rendering the burn violently obvious. "Sunburn?" Lestrade echoed, utterly bewildered. "Precisely," Holmes said. "Mrs. Pendleton's face bears the unmistakable marks of prolonged, direct exposure to intense ultraviolet light. A sunburn, Lestrade, a phenomenon entirely impossible to acquire in a pitch-black damp cellar." Mrs. Pendleton's face went white beneath the redness of her sun-damaged nose. "You are mad. I have sensitive skin. It was a reaction to the mould." "A valiant attempt at misdirection," Holmes replied coolly. "But nature provides us with more than one barometer. Watson, you recall the locket?" "The black square of paper," I said, nodding. "Exactly. Mrs. Pendleton, you claimed the photograph within your novelty locket was ruined by the dampness of your dark confinement. That was your fatal error. Had you known the chemistry of the object you wore, you would have buried it in your pocket." Holmes turned to Lestrade and the banker. "The locket Mrs. Pendleton wears is a recent novelty, a sun picture locket. It does not contain a standard developed photograph. Instead, it holds a piece of paper treated with a delicate coating of silver nitrate. The premise is that the wearer places a small negative or a stencil over the paper and allows the ambient sunlight of their daily walks to slowly darken the exposed silver nitrate, eventually creating a permanent cyanotype or sepia image. I began to see the light. "Good heavens, Holmes!" "Yes, Watson. Silver nitrate is a chemical compound that reacts to light, specifically the ultraviolet rays of the sun. In darkness it remains perfectly white, or at most a pale, cloudy violet over many years. But Mrs. Pendleton's paper was not white. It was not pale. It was entirely uniformly and deeply blackened. It was scorched to a cinder by the sun." Holmes stepped closer to the trembling woman. "For that chemical reaction to occur, for the silver nitrate to blacken so completely through the glass casing, it requires intense, direct, blazing sunlight for a period of several consecutive days. It requires a level of solar radiation that simply does not exist in a sealed, pitch-black, subterranean cellar." The room was deathly silent. The ticking of the mantel clock sounded like a judge's gavel. "So you see, Lestrade," Holmes continued, his voice echoing in the quiet room, "the physical evidence upon her face and the chemical evidence around her neck tell a story entirely contradictory to her words. She was not in the dark. She was in the blazing sun. And given the unseasonably brilliant weather we have enjoyed these past 3 days, I needed only to look at the meteorological reports to find her true location." Holmes picked up a yellow telegram from his desk. "I postulated that to acquire such a sunburn and so thoroughly ruin her silver nitrate locket, she must have been outdoors, likely reclining or sunbathing, in a locale that received uninterrupted sunshine. I checked the weather records for the southern coast. Margate has experienced an unprecedented heat wave and cloudless skies since Monday. I dispatched a telegram to the major seaside hotels in Margate, providing a description of a lady arriving on Monday afternoon, travelling alone, likely under an assumed name, but displaying the distinctive silver novelty locket." He waved the telegram in the air. "I received a reply an hour ago from the manager of the Royal Albion Hotel in Margate, A Mrs. Smith, matching her description perfectly, wearing the very same locket, took a room facing the sea on Monday. She spent Tuesday and Wednesday reclining in a deck chair on the hotel's private terrace, soaking in the sun, entirely undisturbed. She departed hastily this morning, travelling back toward London, where she no doubt disarranged her clothing, rubbed dirt upon her boots, and stumbled onto the Dorking road to spin her tale of the phantom cellar. Mr. Pendleton stared at his wife, his face a mask of horror and dawning realization. "Beatrice, is this true? You gave them the combination? You stole the bonds?" Mrs. Pendleton seemed to shrink into the upholstery. The aristocratic defiance melted away, leaving only a terrified, cornered woman. She opened her mouth to speak, but only a dry sob escaped her. "Who is he?" Lestrade demanded, stepping forward, his policeman's instincts fully ignited. "Who were you protecting?" She buried her face in her hands. It was James," she wept, her voice muffled. "James Harrelson. He was a clerk at the bank. We were going to run away to America. He said if I just gave him the combination and went to the seaside for 3 days, he would handle the rest. He told me to invent the story of the cellar so the police would pity me and not suspect. He promised me he would send for me once the bonds were cashed." "A fool's hope," Holmes said coldly. "Men who manipulate women into treason rarely keep their promises of romantic escape. Lestrade, I suggest you put a watch on the ports for this James Harrelson. With 50,000 in bearer bonds, he will be looking for a ship to New York or Buenos Aires. I'll have the telegraph wires buzzing within the minute," Lestrade declared, his eyes shining. He placed a heavy hand upon Mrs. Pendleton's shoulder. "Beatrice Pendleton, I am arresting you for conspiracy to commit robbery." The formalities were swiftly concluded. The weeping woman and her utterly devastated husband were led away by the inspector, leaving the sitting-room at Baker Street to settle back into its familiar, quiet rhythm. The late afternoon sun was casting long golden shadows across the carpet. Holmes walked to the window, looking down at the street as the police cab rattled away into the London dusk. "A remarkable application of chemistry, Holmes," I remarked, pouring us both a glass of claret. "To deduce an entire conspiracy from a sunburn and a novelty trinket." Holmes turned, accepting the glass with a small smile. "It is the tragedy of the criminal mind, Watson. They construct elaborate fortresses of lies, fortresses with iron doors and pitch-black cellars, designed to withstand the battering ram of police interrogation. But they invariably forget to guard against the silent, incorruptible witnesses of the natural world." He took a sip of his wine, his eyes reflecting the fading light. "A woman may lie, Watson. A lover may betray. But silver nitrate, when exposed to the ultraviolet rays of the Margate sun, will always, inevitably and truthfully, turn black." Thank you for watching. Before you go, don't forget to check out our Patreon.